can get started. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning or evening to all those joining in person and online for this official COP28 side event called Financing for Resilience, Closing the Adaptation Finance Gap. The event is co-sponsored by the Green Innovation Hub and the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. Green Innovation Hub is an independent environmental think tank with a global outlook. GHub advances the policy development and dialogues in cutting-edge areas of sustainable development. It seeks innovative solutions to quality growth, climate resilience, and climate neutrality in China and beyond, contributing to a net zero and nature-positive future. The Boston University Global Development Policy Center is a university-wide research center that works to advance policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the globe. My name is Maria Fernanda Espinosa. I am the co-chair of the Debt Relief for a Green and Inclusive Recovery project, a collaboration between the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, and the Center for Sustainable Finance, SOAS, the University of London, that argues that it is time for a comprehensive debt reform. So welcome all to this side event for the ones present here and the ones following us online. So we are meeting here in Dubai in the midst of very strained negotiations when the need to tackle the climate crisis has never been clearer. The global stocktake is reminding us of the progress while encouraging in some quarters that is far short of where we need to be to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Climate finance is magnitudes of scale before actual need. We have to go from billions to trillions, as we know. Even more, existing climate finance disproportionately favors mitigation. And new research that we're going to hear from today by OECD shows that adaptation finance dropped by 14% since 2021, now making up just over a quarter of total climate finance. In so heavily favoring mitigation finance, climate vulnerable countries are left in a vicious circle of underinvestment and increased vulnerability, higher losses from severe climate events, ballooning sovereign debt, and a high cost of capital. Beyond adaptation finance, climate vulnerable countries will need tremendous resources to invest in nationally determined contributions and facilitate low carbon transitions that are socially just. So how does climate change affect long-term economic growth? How can the adaptation finance gap be sufficiently addressed by development finance institutions and beyond? What kinds of investments would help to build resilience to current and future shocks? And what are the reforms of the international financial system that are necessary to facilitate resilient, nature-positive investments? These are the questions that our superstellar panelists will answer today. And we have indeed a very distinguished panel. I will start with Daniel Titelman. I just want to make sure that he's connected online. Is he connected from Santiago? Okay. So welcome, Daniel. Daniel Titelman is the director of the Economic Development Division of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC. He's also a member of the Task Force on Climate Development and the International Monetary Fund, a global consortium of experts seeking to advance a development-centered approach to integrating climate into operations at the IMF. So welcome, Daniel, and looking forward to listening to you.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
We can hear it perfectly. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, and I don't know if there is a PowerPoint on the screen because I cannot see it. Otherwise, I'll just talk. Well, thank you.
Can we? Yes. I think we are
Very
projecting your
okay,
PowerPoint, Daniel.
okay. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And first of all, I would like to say that I really regret not being able to be there personally, but due to some airplane tickets issues, I couldn't make it. But I really appreciate the invitation and hope that we can contribute to this debate. In the brief minutes that I have, I would like to present a paper that we have written for a research that we're doing for Latin American and Caribbean countries on something that you said, which is we think is very important, the impact that climate change shocks will have in medium and long-term growth and the needs and the challenge of increasing investment to address these shocks and to try to dynamize growth. And at the same time, by trying to address the investment challenge that these climate change shocks will affect public debt sustainability. So basically what we try to do in this paper is to assess the potential impact of the intensification of climate shocks on economic growth and fiscal accounts in some Latin American countries. To do that, we basically analyze 6 climate vulnerable Central American and Caribbean countries: El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Barbados, Dominican Republic, and St. Lucia. And basically what we try to address is the impact of intensifying climate shocks on the level of GDP, the investment requirements to compensate for climate shocks on GDP, the impact of a more conservative investment push based on the national determinant contribution on GDP, and how this investment effort will affect the trajectory of public debt, and also how the trajectory of public debt is highly linked and correlated and with the cost of financing resources. So basically, next one, please. What we will do is basically, the main findings are that climate change will have a significant macroeconomic and social impact in Latin American and Caribbean countries, which basically for this paper, we basically estimate that the level of GDP will be significantly lower by 2050 due to climate change shocks unless it is compensated by large-scale investment. So basically, the main message we want to put on the table in this part is that climate shocks does not only affect the planet and the survival of the planet, but also it affects economic and social dynamics and trajectory for the future. The volume of investment needed to compensate these shocks is very highly inconsistent with the fiscal capacity of these countries and will lead to explosive debt path. And even though if a smaller investment push, those one calculated in the NDCs, the national determinant contributions, are implemented, that will also lead to a public debt unsustainable trajectory. So to respond to these challenges, the investment challenge to compensate and to address climate change shocks, as you mentioned, a huge mobilization of financial resources will be needed. But it's not only having access to the financial resources, but then also the cost of these resources will be central, as we will be showing in 2 or 3 slides, to allow for public investment and fiscal sustainability. So maybe the main message is that it's not only enough to access financial resources, but at the cost that countries access these resources will be a key determinant in terms of their fiscal sustainability and their capacity to address the public investment needs. Next, please. In the next slide, we basically show, I'm not going into the details of the models because of time constraints, but we basically show how for each country, for the level of GDP for these countries by 2050 will be between 9 and 12% lower if we don't have an agudization of the climate shocks. The orange line shows you the trend growth scenario, and the gray line shows you a scenario with an intensification of climate shocks. And depending on the countries, the cost in terms of the level of GDP will be between 9 and 12 percentage points. So that's a huge impact in terms of growth in a region, in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, that today and in the last 30 years, it's been growing very slow. So we have the challenge to dynamize growth, and climate change can be, and the shocks of climate change will probably be a strong impediment in having negative effects on growth unless they're compensated by investment. Thank you. Next one, please. We basically then calculate the investment needs to compensate the climate shocks that drives GDP level between 9 and 12% lower, and it depends on the country. It varies between 7% and 11% on average of GDP. These figures in terms of the investment needs are quite on line with the more global estimates of the investment needs to compensate for climate shocks that are on the right-hand side of the slide. That goes between 3 and 10, 11%, depending on the different estimations and what you're focusing on, but the numbers are quite online with the other estimates of the investment needs. So with these investment needs, basically, it will be private and public, but an important public effect investment will be needed. Next, please. Then what we show is that given that these numbers are quite big for a region that really invests very little, we then calculated and simulated what if countries only do not the full investment needs, but the national determinant contribution investment calculated by countries. And then we see that basically if you do that level of investment, the loss in GDP level by 2050 drops to 5% and 7%. So even though if you're doing the NDCs, you will have a very significant GDP loss by 2050. So the effects of climate change, agudization shocks in terms of GDP growth are very strong, even if you do the NDCs between 5 and 7%. And that is shown in these lines that I will not go into the details because of the time constraint. Next, please. And if you do this NDC investment, basically what we're showing here is the debt trajectory, the public debt dynamics goes under pressure. The orange line is basically the debt dynamics if you don't do the NDC investment, and the yellow line, of course, is the public debt dynamics if you go into and if you do some of the investment to compensate for climate shocks and reduce their negative impact on growth. And basically what you're observing there is that, of course, debt levels goes into an explosive trajectory. So basically the point we want to make is that if we don't do a lot of changes in terms of the macroeconomic and fiscal capacity, at least for these 6, 7, 8 countries, but I will say for regional, for Latin American and Caribbean countries, to be able to mobilize resources to address climate shocks through investment, public finance will be explosive, and we will not be able to do all the investment we are required. So basically the challenge is how are we going to accommodate the investment needs in a stable and non-explosive public debt trajectory. Next, please. And basically with the following exercise, what we do is basically show that if we reduce the effective interest rate that countries are paying today for their sovereign debt by half, basically the debt trajectory stabilizes. So the message here is, by doing this exercise, is trying to say, look, countries will have to issue debt in order to address the public investment needs they require to address part of the climate change shocks, not all of it, because we're doing the NDCs. And if we take current costs of the interest rate that countries are paying today, debt trajectories are explosive. So basically, reducing the financial cost, the possibility of concessional lending will play a key role in building up a consistent and sustainable fiscal trajectory for our countries if we want to do at least part of the investment, if we want to address the investment needs, part of them that are required to address climate change. Next, please. So basically, just to synthesize and not go, basically, what we find is that climate shocks will have a very significant impact on GDP trends between 9 and 12%. To compensate for this negative effect on growth, you need really high investment needs to compensate for these shocks. Even if you take a more conservative assumptions in the terms of public investment efforts, public debt dynamics tends to be explosive and will be deteriorating through time unless you are able to have concessional finance and reduce the cost of financing, in our case, in a very significant magnitude. And then, of course, the international financial institutions should play a catalytic role in reducing financing costs, expanding access to low-cost finance, and support build the capacity of countries to undertake front-loaded investment efforts, which will be key in order to reduce and to avoid the macroeconomic effects of climate shocks within these countries. So just to finish, the main message is, if we don't take into account, if we don't start doing the investment needed to compensate climate shocks, we will have very negative effects on growth, very negative social effects, and public debt will be explosive. So we do need to access financial costs at timely, but also at a much lower financial cost than that we are doing now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel Titelman. This was a bleak picture for Latin America and the Caribbean, a very challenged scenario. I will come back to you with a follow-up question. I forgot to say that a little bit of the script for today, each speaker will speak about between 8 and 10 minutes. I will do a second round for follow-up questions to the speakers, and then we will open the floor for a Q&A section of about 20 minutes. That is going to be a little bit of the choreography, and thank you once again, Daniel, for an excellent presentation, a very concerning and worrisome presentation, I have to say, but I will come back to you with a follow-up question. Let me now turn to Julia Kuklite Polycarp. She's a climate change specialist at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, where she's leading the bank's climate adaptation policy and strategy, as well as overseeing its adaptation investment portfolio. She's responsible for ensuring climate resilience-related assessments are incorporated into investment across various thematic priorities and sectors. Prior to joining the bank, she worked at the Green Climate Fund, conducting assessments of its public sector projects, and at the Ministry of the Environment of Lithuania, managing its special fund for climate change. So she has more than 10 years, 12 years of experience, and we are very, very privileged to have Julia among us. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I've been introduced, I don't need to introduce myself anymore. Very glad to be here and to give you this overview of what AIIB is doing in the field of climate adaptation financing. So let me start with a bit of an introduction of who we are, in case you do not know. So we are an Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. We've been created in 2015, which is exactly the same year as the Paris Agreement. So we see a lot of correlation there. And we have a very strong focus and interest in supporting climate financing. But I'll get into our climate targets and policies a little bit later. What we do is we finance infrastructure for tomorrow. This is our core mandate. And so how do we do that? We do it through a client-responsive approach. So we look at the client needs and we help them to access services and to get them access to physical, digital, and social infrastructure through the investments that we do. How do we do that? Well, we finance projects that have sustainability, connectivity at its core. This is very important for us to support sustainable solutions that enable technological innovation. So we have very sound and robust environmental and social safeguards framework, and we look at projects that are financially and economically sound. We have 4 investment thematic priorities. So we invest in projects that either promote green infrastructure, connectivity and regional cooperation, technologically enabled infrastructure, and we support projects that bring in private capital mobilization. So projects that we are financing need to address at least one of the 4 thematic priorities. So if you see here on the far left-hand side, the green infrastructure is one of our core thematic priorities. And by green infrastructure, we mean projects that support either mitigation, adaptation, or the ones that have other environmental co-benefits. A little bit about the multilateral development banks. I think the previous speaker also alluded to what the IFIs have to do in adaptation finance space, so I wanted to tell you a bit of information on our annual climate finance achievements and specifically what we do in climate adaptation. So as an AIIB, we're part of the multilateral development banks. So together with other IFIs in regional or international, we produce a report every year. It's called Climate Finance Report, and in there we have a very comprehensive information on the financing we provide to developing countries, low and middle income countries. So in the latest report that was actually issued in October this year, we have increased our adaptation financing in total from 17 billion, which was a cumulative number in the year before, 2021. Now it's up to $25 billion in 2022. So we do see a trend, an increase in the adaptation financing. If you look at the types of instruments and how we support that, majority of our investment is going through loans. It's over $14 billion, and we also provide support through grants, equity, policy-based lending, and results-based financing. So just to say here in a nutshell again that even though our adaptation financing is still less, it's only 30% of total climate financing amongst all of the MDBs. It's an increasing trend, and so we're very happy to see that upward. In terms of the countries and the recipients of our funding support, the largest recipients are countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. And if you look at the numbers last year, I think the distribution is slightly different. So it does change from year to year, but this is where we are in terms of the latest financing. Now, in terms of AIIB and our own climate financing targets and achievements so far, so we have committed to finance 50% of all our investment operations to annually be climate financing, which is to be qualified as climate financing. And already last year, 56% of all of our investment was climate financing. So we've already surpassed what we've planned to do by 2025. With our financing now reaching over 50% of all of our investment operations. That is a total of over $2.4 billion last year. And you can see here a distribution. So we do transport, energy, water sector, and multi-sector projects of all of our climate financing operations. And the majority of our climate finance went into countries, so our sovereign clients, but we also did some projects with the private sector, which equaled to 30%. In terms of adaptation financing, however, the number is also not as high. It's very similar to the one that is reported back with the joint MDBs. So our adaptation financing of that total amount was only less than 20%. So we still see challenges in adaptation financing investments, but also there is an upward trend in terms of cumulative volumes of adaptation that we do. So we see some positive signs in increasing that amount year by year. Another important message we want to highlight here is that starting July this year, all of our investment operations have to be Paris aligned. And by Paris aligned, we mean that we look at the projects and how they address both mitigation and adaptation goals of the Paris Agreement. And so we believe that with this specific target, it also supports increase in adaptation financing with the investments that we do. Also, one important note here, I don't think there is a title. So this is our climate action plan. Another thing we wanted to say is that this year we have launched the climate action plan of AIIB, which provides a visionary statement, the guidelines as to where we want to go in the future in terms of our climate finance targets and pathways. So there are 4 principles in our climate action plan Number one is we're client focused, so we're looking at supporting where there is most need for our clients. We also want to ensure we're impactful, and the way we do that is through looking at holistic approaches. So we want to finance projects that have maximize co-benefits of both mitigation, adaptation, and nature-based solutions. So we want to make sure that all of our projects address all of those three dimensions. The third principle is we are being catalytic, and that's again through our plans to mobilize more private sector, make sure that we finance projects through the private sector as well, and bring in more private sector investments through the operations that we do. And the last, fourth principle is innovation. And by innovation, we mean innovation in technologies, financing technological solutions, the groundbreaking ideas and in investments in technologies that are can be scaled up and help the countries to address mitigation and adaptation, and also through innovative financing instruments. So it's the way we finance projects, how we finance projects through our capital markets, through equities, loans, guarantees, etc. We want to make sure that we're also supporting the countries in this regard. So this is on our climate action plan, which was launched this year, and which also highlights kind of the core principles of the way we want to do projects. Now, I wanted to also give you some examples. So it's not only talking about the policies, but it's also giving you some practical examples of what we do in adaptation finance. So I have selected 3 projects. The first one here is the Lightsmith Climate Resilience Partners project. It's an equity fund. We've invested in back in 2020, in August 2020. We've put in $30 million. That project then was scaled up with additional financing from the Green Climate Fund. We were the anchor investor, and then that project was scaled up with the further financing from the Green Climate Fund. And the core investment thesis of that project is actually investing into adaptation technologies. So it's very focused, and it's very concretely addressing the needs to bring in more technological innovation in the adaptation space. So, you know, be it the companies and the services, it's through private equities that will address that. And we've actually heard very interesting stories of the portfolio companies that were already receiving the financing from AIIB in this regard. So, for example, there are companies that are looking into the infrastructure leaks through the satellite images and can see and identify which infrastructure where there, for example, the pipes may have some water leakages, or we looked at the companies that can identify which infrastructure it has some risks in being kind of break in the future, so then you can quickly tackle that and identify and finance this. So we're very glad that these are very kind of concrete examples of adaptation technologies in the private sector that we have supported with AIIB. Second project is the flood emergency and rehabilitation project in China. This is a very large project we've financed 2 years ago following a severe flooding that happened in the 3 municipalities in Henan province in China, and in there we were supporting infrastructure rehabilitation post severe flooding that was addressing the flood management and urban drainage system rehabilitation and reconstruction, and it's kind of a large-scale urban resilience project that was helping the cities to adapt. In fact, this project has a total of 20 million beneficiaries, so it's really a large-scale project. We've supported the government of China to address the risks of climate change. And the last project that I wanted to also emphasize here is a project we did in Turkey with the risk mitigation and emergency preparedness. $300 million we've provided to the Istanbul government to address the disaster resilience of the critical public buildings. And so the rehabilitation happened on mostly schools and other public buildings to withstand, one, earthquake shocks, but also the significant potential physical risks to climate change. So when you're rehabilitating buildings, they were also addressing the need to make them more stronger to withstand flooding, extreme heat, cyclones, etc., etc. So that project was supporting both on the earthquake risks as well as climate risks. And a total number of beneficiaries that are benefiting from this project is over 120,000 people in the city of Istanbul. So with those 3 projects, all very different, a private sector fund with a small amount and a very large urban resilience project in addressing 3 provinces in China with a third project that is addressing both the earthquake risks as well as climate risks with the rehabilitation of public buildings, we do see that AIIB is focusing on making sure we are financing more projects in adaptation and infrastructure space particularly. And I'm happy to respond to any follow-up questions on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. That was great. And thank you for closing with very concrete examples so we can see in practice what the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is doing on adaptation. And congrats for the plus 50% financing of climate, but also less than 20% in adaptation. We saw that. And so the follow-up question I will ask basically how to scale up the efforts that the bank is doing. Now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Jingjie Chen. I hope I pronounced it right. She's a senior program officer at Green Innovation Hub. Through independent research and strategic communication on climate governance, she's dedicated to promoting the understanding and insights of the public enterprises and policymakers towards climate change in order to raise the climate momentum of relevant stakeholders and foster climate action in China. Jingjie is one of the major editors of China Climate Wire. So you have the floor.
Thank you. Let me open the slide first. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today and present Mobilizing Finance for Resilience and discussing more about the incentives and the standards using the case of Southeast Asia and China. So I'm Yingjie from Green Innovation Hub, which is an independent environmental NGO think tank in China. Since 2012, we have started engaging in global environmental governance and with the goal of promoting sustainable development in China and beyond. So through policy research and dialogue exchanges, we really want to promote the sustainable development in China. So let's start. As climate change and risk worsen, the financial gap for adaptation is actually substantial and continues to grow and widen. So the latest adaptation report actually reveals the costs for developing countries by 2030 will range from 215 billion to 387 billion per year. So despite the urgent needs to accelerate and scale up international climate finance flows, the international public adaptation finance to developing countries actually shrink by 15% in 2021. So the adaptation gap is likely to be 10 to 18 times as great as current international adaptation finance flows. So at least 5% higher than previous range estimation. There are several barriers for us to mobilizing funds for adaptation activities. At the policy level, according to the global stocktake, the technical report of global stocktake, most observed adaptation efforts actually are fragmented and incremental. So we actually lack a holistic approach of adaptation policy. So the current policy documents do not adequately capture the access of financial demands of those activities. And further, there is a lack of clarity regarding the standards of activities, methods, and how to measure their benefits, and also the disclosure requirements of this kind of activities. So for financial institutions, particularly for first of all, development financial institutions actually need to play a more active role in leading and leveraging financing towards adaptation activities. And for private sector or investors, it's difficult for them to leverage private capital because most of the adaptation projects, they have a quite long-term circle and limited returns and they lack of incentives to do so. Currently, the private investment models are not adapted to small-scale and medium-scale projects of local-driven or community-driven adaptation activities. And for data, actually we have limited data and information on future climate risks, so that we need to further enhance the climate risk assessment process. And we also lack of methodologies to measure the adaptation benefits. According to an ongoing study conducted by Green Innovation Hub, we actually examined the current adaptation policies in Southeast Asia and aim to understand their adaptation needs. So all the 10 countries in this region have developed at least one adaptation plan, strategy, or relevant policy. However, among them, only 3 countries have released the national adaptation plans, which is NAPs. However, in order to facilitate the adaptation finance, the government structure requires further improvement, including the implementation of specific adaptation policies, framing and implement the specific adaptation policies, and giving sectorial instructions, and also establish the time-bound targets and roadmaps. And by analyzing their adaptation priorities outlined in the documents, we actually discovered not all the sectors that could be affected by climate change are identified as adaptation priorities. While agriculture and food security, ecosystem management, and water resource management are frequently mentioned, other important sectors like energy, disaster risk management, and also transport receive less attention or only partially mentioned. Southeast Asia countries actually facing significant gap in adaptation finance. Also, they have difficulty estimating their financial needs. Only 4 out of 10 nations in Southeast Asia have estimated their financial needs for adaptation, and ranging from $334 to $371 billion. And it is important to note that a majority of the required finance depending on international support. Actually, mobilizing adaptation finance requires a clear policy instrument and structured adaptation priorities. So the main climate risks, on the left, I listed the main climate risks of rising temperature and extreme weather events, and also sea level rise and water scarcity. And the key sectors might be impacted are according to the IPCC report. Actually, in 2022, China released its National Adaptation Strategy 2035, and listed its adaptation priorities such as early warning systems, water system, and ecosystem, agriculture and food security, health, infrastructure, and other sensitive industries, including finance and tourism. The logic here is categorizing sectors with their climate vulnerability and risk exposed. So when we are doing adaptation policies, we need to mobilize money for adaptation, we need to really define the adaptation priorities and trying to expand the scope of the sectors. And currently, there are very few taxonomies specifically focusing on adaptation for financial institutions. So in collaboration with IFC, our institution also compares the relevant example lists from IFC and also the existing green taxonomies in China. We assess whether those activities or projects align with the 4 key elements of adaptation, which are whether they reduce risk, exposure, or vulnerability of climate change, and whether they could enhance resilience and enable adaptation activities, or they are rapid response activities to climate hazards. So our finding indicated that green taxonomies in China cover several key areas related to adaptation. However, the sectors such as industry, energy, and ICT, financial services, and other cross-cutting issues like health are not fully addressed. Further, it is challenging to evaluate how much extent which activities contribute to adaptation. Therefore, it is necessary to expand the taxonomy, the scope, and to give more details to the investors or financial institutions to reduce their financing costs. In the context of global cooperation, public finance remains the primary source funding for South-South climate cooperation between China and Southeast Asia. So we picked up an example using South-South climate cooperation. So as of June 2023, China has allocated over 1.2 billion RMB for this purpose. And in terms of adaptation, the majority of projects actually focus on agriculture. Following, there are several projects in the sectors of ecosystem, energy infrastructure, and disaster management. The main approaches are using for including resource aid, capacity building, and knowledge sharing, and also collaborative research. To enhance so finally we come back to our title. So to enhance the mobilization of financial resource for future adaptation efforts, we actually propose several recommendations according to our studies. And first of all, it is important to conduct comprehensive climate risk assessments at the local, national, and also regional level. And this will help us understand the future shocks and determine where the funds should go. And secondly, we need to provide standards and guidance for local government officials and financial institutions and investors and other relevant stakeholders. Additionally, we should consider expanding the range of adaptation activities that included in those kind of taxonomies. Thirdly, it is crucial to develop appropriate metrics that could evaluate the benefits of adaptation financing and also enhance the information disclosure during this process. And to promote better cooperation, we could promote mutual recognition of standards and taxonomies within sub-regions. And in the context of international cooperation, we should explore and also expand the scope of cooperation sectors according to their adaptation needs, as we examine in the policy documents mentioned by Southeast Asia countries. And we also need to develop innovative and more inclusive approaches, including technical assistance and context-based capacity building at the local level or at the community level. And we could try to engage a wider range of stakeholders and to diversify the financial flows and to better mobilize money for adaptation, and especially during international cooperation. So that's my presentation today, and thanks for your listening and patience. Maybe we could further discuss the topics in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Excellent, Jinjie. Really an applause. I think this was very interesting, very thorough, and I think that gives us the reasons why we urgently need a new goal on adaptation. I think that would make the homework much easier, and we, of course, as you said very, very well, We need to work on the data and the metrics in a common baselines and standards. It's very important to quantify and better understand the benefits of investing in adaptation, to scale up the amount of money and the cost of the money invested on the adaptation front. And I cannot see here nor there, but just correct me if I'm wrong, you said that there is a need for 334 something billion in adaptation for Asian countries. Did I miss that?
For Southeast Asia countries?
Oh, for the Southeast Asia countries. Okay, well, that's an important amount, I would say. And last but not least, the great Rishikesh Ram Bhandary with us. He's the Assistant Director of the Global Economic Governance Initiative at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. He's an expert on climate finance and international climate negotiations. He's also a member of the Task Force on Climate Development and the IMF, as well as a member of the Debt Relief for a Green and Inclusive Recovery Project. So, Rishi, you have the floor for 8 to 10 minutes.
Great, thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here with all of you today. We've heard from Daniel the general macroeconomic dimensions, especially in terms of the challenges that we face by climate change in the Latin American region and the Caribbean as well. And we've also heard about the need for really scaling up adaptation investments from the two speakers who went before me. And so what I'm going to do in my particular presentation is to really tie some of these elements together and to really connect the discussions that we're having here at the COP with the broader need to reform the international financial architecture. And so, as we all know, there is a poly crisis of multiple shocks, and that has really increased the vulnerability of developing countries precisely at the time when we really need to mobilize a big push. As we all know, time is of the essence, and we have a very critical decade ahead of us, and so therefore there really is a need for us to figure out how exactly can we best have frameworks for international cooperation that can allow this big push to really take place. Now, one chart that I really wanted to highlight is this vicious cycle of debt and climate change, which of course may be common knowledge to this particular audience. But just to start with the high cost of capital, I mean, as we all know, many climate vulnerable countries face a special risk premium, which makes borrowing more expensive. Thereby, they are likely to underinvest in the very critical infrastructure that is really required, which again, simply enhances or increases the vulnerability to the very same climate impacts that they are already more vulnerable to. And that simply leads to higher losses, and which then again creates a higher debt burden. And so as we see this vicious cycle simply continuing, and so there is a very clear need to really break this cycle so that countries can actually focus on making sure that they have the fiscal space to really make the investments that they need to. This is a chart from an UNCTAD report that really puts in perspective the debt servicing costs that countries face in relation to very important societal goals, such as in education, in investment, and in health. And as you can see, as indicated by the little weights, that the proportion that countries are spending, has substantially increased in those, relative to those areas. So they're spending a lot more money. They're, very precious public resources on servicing debt rather than really making those productive investments that they have to. And here I just wanted to very quickly underscore that the case for sub-Saharan Africa is particularly acute. Debt distress is a special problem that many of the countries in the sub-Saharan region really face. And it's not on the slide, but 80% of the climate finance needs are actually being spent on debt servicing payments. And here we have a paper that we did earlier this year that really shows the situation of debt distress in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, further accentuating this problem is the fact that the cost of capital has been on the rise, now which simply makes investments even more challenging. And this is, as you can see on the chart, the various shocks, the Poli crisis that I mentioned at the beginning, which is really making borrowing a lot more expensive and therefore more challenging for countries to really make the investments that they need to. Now, pulling some of those pieces together, here we created an index which combines debt variables with mitigation, that is reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as debt and adaptation. And this shows how these two dimensions really interact. And we've plotted this across the map with various colors, red being where the interaction is the strongest. And as you can see how the need for adaptation investments, the need for mitigation investments really interacts with debt in a strong way in the countries that are in red. Now, finally, just after laying out some of this context, I wanted to put forward some of the key ideas that we have been advancing through the debt relief for a green and inclusive recovery project, for example, where number one, in regards to the sovereign debt architecture that we have, it's very clear that the G20 Common Framework falls short in four key areas. Number one, that the assessment of debt is flawed, right? That the debt sustainability analysis doesn't really include climate change in a comprehensive way, and therefore does not accurately capture the fiscal situation of a country. Second, many middle-income countries are locked out of the framework, and therefore all climate-vulnerable countries do not have access to the common framework. Third, it doesn't compel all creditors to the table, and therefore we've seen very prolonged and drawn-out debt restructuring negotiations, and not enough incentives for all creditors to actually participate in a speedy and timely resolution. And most importantly, for our discussions here at the COP, that there really isn't really not just a strong link, but any real link to climate change and development goals in terms of how the debt restructuring process has really been going on. And so in terms of the broader core elements of reform that are really needed, first of all, as we heard from other speakers, there is a very clear need to really increase the scale of investments. So there's the need for a stepwise increase in the size of development finance institutions, as well as the global financial safety net, more broadly speaking. Second, that significant reforms that align these institutions with the ability for countries to really make and enable the structural transformations are absolutely crucial. And third, we also know that many of these institutions don't adequately represent or reflect the voice of many developing countries, and so therefore there's a need for them to really be reformed so that the governance really reflects the diversity of the international community. And so let me end with just one or two more slides. Here, this is a proposal that we have made, and it really brings together three pieces that we see as very vital in a debt relief framework. The first one, the first pillar on I guess your far left side, the public and multilateral creditors pillar, that one is comprehensive debt relief. The second pillar is pertaining to private and commercial creditors. And finally, for those countries that don't have active debt distress right now, there is a need to really focus on bending down the cost of capital, which, as I noted, has really gone up. So how do we think about credit enhancement and really making sure that that low-cost, long-term finance is really available to those countries that don't necessarily face debt distress very imminently. Now, of course, a very important part of this is enhancing the debt sustainability analysis so that we really reflect and prioritize the need to make development and climate change investments so that when we do the math, that the math really reflects and prioritizes the spending needs that countries have. And so finally, and I'll stop here, first of all, there really has to be a general capital increase so that, even though, and as we heard from AIIB, there's a lot going on, but of course for these banks to do more, there has to be more money that goes into these banks so that they can offer a much bigger envelope, but also higher quality in terms of the level of concessionality and also the nature of impact that those instruments could really achieve. Number one. Second, the DSA, of course, this is a very technical document, but it's very crucial to really undergirding the entire debt discussion. So therefore, there's a real need to really make sure that the DSA really has the climate change elements baked into it. And we have a big opportunity with the IMF reviewing the low-income countries' debt sustainability framework this coming year. And finally, the IMF has a special role to play in terms of its surveillance activities. Given the sheer amount, volume of data the IMF collects, in terms of really making sure that we are making sure that climate risks are taken into account, but also the benefits of investing in resilience are fully reflected in those surveillance activities. I'll end on the importance of, one of the trusts that the IMF has. We've heard a lot of discussion at this COP about the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. There's another trust at the IMF called the Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust. This is one of the debt relief trusts that the IMF has. And this trust basically allows countries to pay their IMF loans for about 2 years, as long as there's a qualifying event. So it really gives countries the breathing space to focus on rebuilding, on recovery and rehabilitation when there is a qualifying event. And so therefore there really is this opportunity to make sure that this trust is really scaled up and therefore gives countries that breathing space to really focus on rehabilitation and recovery, which is so important immediately after major climate impacts. So let me pause there and pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rishi, and I think you deserve an applause. Thank you, and I'll come back to you also for a follow-up questions. So very quick follow-up questions. Perhaps I'll start with you, Julia. And basically, you showed an increase in climate finance from the bank, but also an extra effort to increase the percentage in adaptation. What are the actions that you foresee, not only of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, but in general of multilateral banks, to make sure that there is a visible scaling up of investment in adaptation?
Thank you. Excellent question, and one that probably requires a lot of thinking, talking, and conversations. So yes, indeed, adaptation financing is severely underfinanced, right? That we don't have enough funding flowing to adaptation, but I think there are several reasons for that. First is that adaptation is really very context specific. And so if, for example, you can look and say, we need to reduce GHG emissions, and we can simply consider all of possible solutions to do that, be it renewable energy, energy storage, sustainable transport, etc. When it comes to adaptation, it all starts with the vulnerability risk assessments, right? And our speaker from the Green Innovation has alluded to that as well. You need to do this comprehensive mapping of the different risks and vulnerabilities to understand where the project pipeline coming from. And there is not sufficient data to address this, and so that the multilateral development banks like ourselves can look and see where the actual need is. And it's not only coming from the point of view of the risk assessment, but it's also coming from the point of view of the country needs, right? I've said earlier, we are a client-driven bank, right? And there was also one of the challenges highlighted by the Green Innovation about the fact that the countries have the national adaptation plans, but they also don't provide clear picture of where their adaptation financing needs are. So there's this significant lag as well at the country level to tell this is where we want the adaptation money to go. So when the countries don't really tell us this is where we want our money to go, then it's hard for us to proactively go out there and finance those type of projects. So this is a little bit on the challenges we do, but also in terms of our thinking going forward, what we want to make sure is that the private sector is engaged, because you will see the climate finance landscape report by the CPI just recently gave us the numbers, and they say that 90%, over 90% of all adaptation financing is going through the DFI. So it's the multilateral development banks and the national development banks and not the private sector. Private sector is really not there. And how do we do that? Is we tell them there is a business case for adaptation. And we've been trying to say that, and we wanted to actually break this myth that there is no business case for adaptation. So what we did this year as an AIIB, we issued a first Asia adaptation bond. So we had actually institutional investors interested in buying bonds from us so that we then invest more into the projects that support resilient infrastructure investments. So we think that bringing in the private sector, having more projects with the private sector, speaking to our investment officers that are then subsequently having conversations with their clients, you know, in the countries, in Brazil, in Pakistan, and those banks themselves, if they find the project pipeline that can address the needs for adaptation, we think there will be a significant upscale in that. And maybe just the last point is the sectors that have significant potential is the urban resilience and water resource management sectors. We do see that there is this water scarcity issue, and there's this issue of growing population. So there will be more and more need to improve the urban resilience. The cities will be growing, and as they grow, they have to absolutely address the needs to be more adapted to the climate change.
Thank you, Julia. And that's a really nice way to address Jinjie, because you mentioned the obstacles to bring in private finance and private investment, and you mentioned that as well. What are the obstacles? But also to reflect a little more on your call for better data, different metrics, new taxonomies to really give the power and the value of investing more in adaptation. We need to know that is good business in a way. So over to you. You know, short answer, so perhaps there are questions from the floor that we speakers would like to take afterwards.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. And for like really mobilizing money in adaptation field, actually I think the enabling environment is very important. First of all, we need to like really mainstream adaptation in the policy making process. For example, for policymakers, we noticed that the adaptation specific policies they stand alone actually not have a very direct link or solid link with other policies in other sectors. So when the policymakers or investors consider this kind of they're making their investment decisions, they may lack of this kind of awareness that they could like invest money into this kind of fields. And those kind of policy guidelines or documents could lead them away to and tell them what kind of aspects money is really needed to enhance the adaptation capability. And also, I think as for data, actually a lot of financial flows in adaptation sector are domestic financial flows. So I looked some of the reports that made by other institutions, and for international financial flows on adaptation, the data quality is much better than what it is in domestic. So for for example, for national development banks, they could try to disclosure the data on how they are doing adaptation activities and let us really know what's happened now and what money has already flow into this field and what kind of projects have been promoted, and I think that's important.
Well, thank you. I think that you are so right, and you also mentioned, the countries that have not developed their national adaptation plans and how national adaptation plan connect to their NDCs. I mean, in a cross-sectoral way, and your call for a cross-sectoral approach, I think it's critical. You said, adaptation is very much context-specific, but that's how, the reason why we need, a global goal on adaptation. We need comparability among national adaptation plans. We need to make the economic, financial, macroeconomic case for a greater investment in adaptation. So thank you very much. I will turn now to Daniel. You're still with us. We haven't forgotten you. We're missing you here, but we haven't forgotten you. And of course, being from Ecuador, the information you shared with us is extremely, concerning, to speak about a drastic decrease in GDP because of lack of investment in climate and adaptation specifically, to speak about a drop of 9 to 12%, I think, decrease in GDP, and 5 to 7% to 2050. So these numbers are, of course, extremely scary. But you also called for an exponential increase in climate investment to be better prepared for climate shocks, of course. But it's not about the amount of money, which need to increase exponentially, but also the cost of capital. What are the reforms that are needed in the international financial institutions to make it happen, but also the structural transformations that are needed domestically in Latin American countries, which we know suffer from this vicious circle of low productivity, high inequality. What needs to change to revert this trend? Over to you, Daniel.
Well, thank you very much, and also miss not the possibility of being there personally, but hope next time we will be able to meet. Relative to your questions, well, I will basically try to highlight two issues which have already been put on the table by the other speakers. First, the significant need to scale up investment in adaptation. And basically, as you all put it, not disregarding the private efforts that has to be done in adaptation, up to now is being a basic public investment effort that should be addressed and scale up from adaptation resources. So basically, if countries need to start investment in adaptation, they will put a lot of pressure in their fiscal accounts and their fiscal space. And one key element is that we have to be able to expand fiscal space in our countries, not only by, as usually was the case, by reducing expenditures, but because we do need to expand investment and other social expenditures over time, but increase the capacity of countries to increase their fiscal incomes and at the same time to issue debt at reasonable and sustainable cost. And that's the key element that we think. I mean, we have to expand the fiscal space through increasing fiscal incomes, and that's, I will address the domestic question you were asking. And at the same time, we have to be able to reform the financial architecture and the debt restructuring mechanism that Rishi was putting on the table to be able also to scale up fiscal space in our countries. Relative to the fiscal space and the international financial architecture, as you all have mentioned, it is key to upscale the amount of resources available to finance investment in adaptation, but also to reduce the cost through concessional lending or through other mechanisms that countries have access, but at the same time they have access at the cost that will make debt path sustainable. And that requires a huge amount of reforms that I don't have time to go into details now, but I will think that it requires a change in the mindset. We have to understand that if we're going to introduce climate change investment into the fiscal policy strongly, we have to change the way we will be thinking about debt sustainability and fiscal space, and we have to open up more to increase resources. From the domestic side, we have to do a lot of reforms in terms of not only increasing our tax intake, but also changing our tax structure, which is very regressive. Latin America, almost 50% of the tax incomes comes from value-added tax, which is a very regressive tax. We have to move towards more direct taxations in order to increase our tax intakes, our fiscal incomes through taxation, but also improve the redistribution capacity of fiscal policy to address climate change, not only in their investment needs, but also in their social needs. And just to finish, we have to also move towards a change in the development paradigm, where we will have to start building up new productive structures that are more friendly to climate issues. We have to go through changes in our energy matrix and other big changes that will require a lot of public investment and adaptation investment. Thank you.
Whoa. Thank you, Daniel. And these are small asks, a mindset change to include fully climate and fiscal policies and priorities, and a dramatic shift in the development paradigm in Latin America and the Caribbean. These are not small asks, but I would also highlight the need to rethink the tax structure. And I agree with you of the regressive nature of our tax policies in general in the region, and many more, excellent ideas that you shared with us. So the task ahead is enormous, but it's not impossible. I think we need to start somewhere, and for sure, to increase investment in climate adaptation is urgent. And Latin America is among, as we all know, one of the climate vulnerable parts of the world, especially the dry corridor in Central America and other countries. So this is at the core of the future of the development of the future of development in Latin America and the Caribbean. So thank you again, Daniel, for being with us. And I would like to close the second round of questions before I give the floor to you, if you have any questions. But Rishi, let's imagine for a moment that you are the pen holder here at COP, and you are told you have now, the opportunity and the possibility to include one full paragraph at the GST on debt restructuring and relief. What would you write? Because, the analysis is so right. We need debt restructuring, but for that to happen, we need to reform the international financial architecture. We need to reduce the cost of capital. We need an exponential increase of the amount of money that is out there, but we need to change the governance profoundly in the multilateral development bank. So, and we need to change the debt sustainability analysis paradigm. And you ended with, some very concrete things that the IMF can do. So you have now the possibility of writing that magical paragraph on debt restructuring and include it in the GST. What would you write? Sorry to, it's off guard, but...
Yeah, no, thank you. I know we're discussing very small questions here today. So to me, a very big or a key question when it regards, when we think about the GST, is how can countries come back with stronger pledges? That really is, I think, the question that's really at the heart of the global stocktake, because we know there's a huge gap. So how can we make sure implementation really happens in a very strong way? And how can we make sure that countries have the comfort they need to really close that ambition gap? And I'll give you one very concrete example. Last year when Egypt was chairing the COP, and the COP presidency announced its enhanced NDC. And Egypt said very clearly, if we did not have to spend so much money on debt servicing needs, we would have come back with an even more enhanced pledge. And so to me, that really captures the situation that many countries are actively in right now. And so the GST at the end of the day is also about means of implementation, right? Not just mitigation or adaptation, but also the means of implementation. And so that's what I would, if I had the pen, I would really make sure that we were sending a very strong signal to the international community about the very close association between debt distress and climate ambition. And I would also reiterate the call that was made by the COP last year in terms of really making sure that the multilateral development banks continue on with the second phase, if you will, of reforms. And we've already seen the World Bank implement a range of things through its evolution roadmap, but it's also time for the bigger ticket reforms to also be a part of that discussion, and for that evolution roadmap to really percolate throughout the MDBs. And as the G20 has said, MDBs really have to work together as a system. And so, how can we really make sure that the MDBs also rise up to the moment that we are really in, especially given the very high cost of capital that many countries face. So just a one-line summary would be to really underscore the very close relationship between climate change and debt distress, and to really send that strong signal about low-cost concessional finance needing to be available to climate-vulnerable countries.
Superb. And if I was I am not anymore, but for a long time, a climate negotiator, I would say, of course, approved. This couple of sentences would make a big, big difference. Let me now turn to our audience here for questions to our panelists. I have no idea what time we should be finishing. How much time do we have?
Maybe 10 minutes.
We have 12 minutes, and I see several hands up. I will start with the gentleman here in the first row, and then I will turn to this side for 2 more questions. Please, you introduce yourselves and just mention the name of the question, of the person you're directing your question to. Please, you have the floor.
Thanks very much. I'm Sam Gill from China Dialogue Trust. I will direct my question to Rishikesh. This has been a really fantastic discussion, really admirable how nuanced and complex, and how you're not afraid of big questions. To add to those, would you be able to say a bit about the role that China could play in this regard, particularly with regard to debt restructuring? I understand, of course, that it's a complex question that's often mischaracterized, but China is still the largest sovereign creditor, can play a very important role. There's a deadlock within the common framework sort of process. So does the approach laid out here provide some opportunities for resolving that? Thank you.
Thank you. You want to respond immediately, Rishi, or you want us to gather more questions perhaps and then come back to our panelists? Let's do that. Okay, the person from India, we said hello before, and then I will turn to you.
So thank you, great comments from all the panelists. I'm Avantika Goswami from CSE New Delhi. One of the panelists mentioned this evolving Paris alignment of finance. And I was wondering if I could pose this question to anybody on the panel. One thing we've heard from various CSO representatives and at least one economist, that there are some concerns about this developing into green conditionalities and imposing top-down criteria on countries that might actually narrow funding streams depending on whether or not a project is Paris aligned. Is this concern misguided, or is it, accurate. I'd love to hear the opinion of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you for a great question. They call it climate adjustment as well, but I'm sure the panelists will answer to your excellent question. You have the floor.
I'm Yunwen, working with FS. My question is to Julia. You just mentioned AIIB just launched an adaptation bond. I just want to know what kind of investor like to purchase such kind of bond, and what's the projects that covered by this bond? Yeah.
Thank you. Very straightforward question. I don't see any more hands up, I think. Okay, so I will do something. There are direct questions to the panelists. You can answer the questions, but then I will give you like 1 minute for 2 or 3 headlines for the newspaper tomorrow. So why don't we start with Rishi, and we will move to Julia. Then I will go to Danielle and who else? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that question regarding China. Now, of course, let me phrase it more generally in terms of the, one of the big challenges that we're facing, and this is one of the core diagnoses that our project has made, is that the creditor landscape has changed so substantially over the last 30 years, which is precisely why we're in this period where it's so difficult to get agreement, because we have a much larger set of creditors, and it's not just the Paris Club that is the game in town, right? And so because there is such a big diversity, it means really making sure that we are thinking about the incentives of all the creditors, as well as the debtor governments, to make sure that we have a robust framework in place. Now, of course, the role of China varies substantially depending on which country. We also have to think about how the role of China varies depending on debt service payments as well as debt stock, right? So sometimes we confuse the two, but I think we need to keep that distinction in mind. But I think at the core, and which is what I said in my presentation, the G20 Common Framework as it currently exists is not equipped with the right tools to really bring all creditors to the table. And so that's something that really needs to be a part of the conversation, so that all creditors come to the table and make sure that there is a very timely and expedited resolution, because at the end of the day, the longer these negotiations get drawn out, the more actual economic pain and suffering countries or people actually face, because this is not a fun process, right? Having your country go through a very drawn out debt negotiation. So let me pause there and then pass it over to my panelists for their other inputs.
Thank you, Rishi. And indeed, the basket of creditors is extremely complex, and I think that one size fits all for debt relief, doesn't work. I mean, we need very tailor-made in the case of countries that are not a Paris Club countries. For bilateral debt, I think, a lot of creativity and political will is needed on that front. Let me now turn to Julia, because you had very specific questions also from the audience.
Yes, thank you. The 2 questions are very good ones indeed. So I'll start with the one on Paris alignment. When we committed to do Paris alignment plans, and to say that we will be only investing into projects that address both mitigation and adaptation, we also very clearly saw this as an opportunity rather than a box-ticking exercise, we call that. So we were very explicit to say that with our commitment to be Paris aligned, we will make sure that the types of projects we're looking at are indeed the ones that are helping countries to adapt to climate change, move into the cleaner energy sources, and address the energy transition element of it. So that's one side of the story. Another element of it is that if you look at our Paris alignment methodology and the assessment and review, the way we do that, we always emphasize that it needs to be based on countries' capabilities, visibility, what are their plans, and how we can help them to commit to do that in the long term. So it's never really that, okay, you do not have a climate risk management system, so we'll not finance your project. it's always, okay, how can we help you to make sure that in the long term you do that? So the Paris alignment assessment methodology is really always based on the long-term planning and the specific circumstances of the countries and their commitment to decarbonization pathway in the long term, rather than telling them that, you know, we cannot finance your project at all because it's not meeting our immediate goals. So that's on the Paris alignment commitments. And on the adaptation bond, so we issued the bond in Australian dollars market. It was done in May this year. It was priced for 500 million Australian dollars, but it actually was oversubscribed in double. So there was huge demand and interest from the institutional investors. We have a detailed list of all of the investors by category on our website. You can have a look, but it's basically private institutional investors operating in Australian market, as well as actually central banks, interestingly, across of the globe. So those are some of the examples as to who were interested in this specific bond. And in terms of the project pipeline, underlying project pipeline, those were projects, like I said, primarily addressing resilient infrastructure, but we also put a cap to make sure that you know, only the projects that have significant adaptation financing are included in that project pipeline. So those were the projects in, like the ones I've given the examples on the urban resilience, energy sector, changing energy sector so that the actual transmission lines are also more withstanding the severe shocks of extreme heat and flooding, for example, as well as transport sector and the urban flooding management type of projects.
Thank you, Julia. Chinjie, would you like to comment?
And maybe one comment on the 1.5 Celsius degree alignment. I think for developing countries, especially from the CSO perspective, I think aligning with this target requires financial technology as well as capacity building support from developed countries and also other potential stakeholders. So that also happened in adaptation. So we cannot, without this kind of support and just pushing the targets on any parties or any relevant stakeholders. And I think it's unequal to do so. So that's what I want to say.
Thank you. And indeed, we do need a global goal on adaptation that would make life easier for countries, for everybody, for investment. And I think that would help us with the metrics that you mentioned very well, Chinjie. And yes, and higher ambition means better means of implementation. We've been saying this since day one of the convention: more money, low carbon tech transfer and capacity for developing countries. Let me now call on Daniel for last words before we end, because I think we're approaching the end. So you have the last word over in Santiago, Daniel.
Well, thank you very much. Well, basically, just to mention two things that I think are important relative to the questions from the floor. First, that the conditionality is a word that brings out other issues, and I think that alignment, as Julia was mentioning, alignment with the Paris agreements is basically to try to create incentive to mobilize from a medium and long-term perspective investment towards adaptation. So I will try not to confuse the issue of conditionality, as we already know it in other issues, and the idea that we need to provide incentive and have a strategic planning for investment in adaptation. And second, I think that the thematic bonds, like the example of the Australian issue bond, are very promising mechanisms to mobilize private resources at a lower cost for financing adaptation investment. So I think that also that's a mechanism that has to explore and deepen, and for at least for Latin American countries, it's been a very promising way of getting into the financial market at lower cost and better maturities. So that's also a very promising mechanism. And just to finish, I just like to congratulate all the panelists, because we have put on the table the issue that we really need to start doing policies and big changes in order to incorporate climate change investment adaptation needs into the macro context, but also in the planning strategy and development strategy of our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Congratulations to our incredible panelists today. This was a very, very rich discussion. I wouldn't even dare to summarize. It's impossible, but I think that there is a lot of food for thought. And let's hope that the final outcome of the COP is also up to the task. And really, we have the political will that are needed from our leaders, the vision and the responsibility with a climate-safe future for all. So thank you once again to the organizers, to the incredible panelists, and to you for being here. And to the air conditioning that makes me cough. Thank you. Thank you.